On a winter night in London, hundreds of people crowded into the Battersea Arts Centre for a reunion party. Outside, in full view of the street and just steps away from a police station, two men were cut down in a sudden ambush. Witnesses later described the killers as calm, deliberate, almost mechanical, as if the attack had been rehearsed. The violence looked less like a brawl and more like a public execution. But despite dozens of attackers, clear intent, and the sheer brazenness of the assault, not a single murder conviction was ever secured. How did it happen? And why did the justice system fail to hold anyone fully accountable? What this video will deliver. In the next 25 minutes, you'll hear a straight timeline of what unfolded that night outside Battersea Arts Centre, how rival motorcycle clubs built up the tension that led to bloodshed, and what investigators uncovered in the weeks that followed. We'll look closely at the court case, why the charges that seemed certain fell apart, and how the families of the dead were left without full justice. Every detail comes from reliable sources, reporting from The Guardian and The Independent, background from Crime and Investigation UK, and local history preserved on lavenderhill.uk. Together, they give us a picture that is both shocking and unresolved. An ambush carried out in public, yet a case that still leaves unanswered questions about accountability and power. Setting the scene. On the last night of January in 1998, the Battersea Arts Centre in South London was alive with noise, music, and memories. The annual Rockers reunion was not just another concert. It was a nostalgic gathering for men and women who had lived through Britain's original motorcycle and cafe racer scene of the 1950s and 60s. By the late 90s, these reunions had grown into large social events, drawing more than 1,000 people eager to reconnect with an era of jukeboxes, leather jackets, and roaring Triumphs and Nortons. It was meant to be a night of celebration, not confrontation. To keep order, event organizers relied on security help from the Outcasts Motorcycle Club, a decision that would later prove fateful. Outcasts members were visible near the doors and inside the building, acting as both guardians and part of the crowd. To most attendees, their presence was nothing unusual. In fact, security provided by a club with local roots gave many the feeling that things were under control. People were laughing, drinking, and swapping stories of their younger days, with the Arts Centre's old Victorian halls filled with a sense of comfort and camaraderie. But the stage was set for something darker. What looked like an ordinary Saturday night reunion was, in reality, a perfect opportunity for rivals who had been tracking the Outcasts for months. Behind the laughter and nostalgia, forces were moving that would soon turn a night of music into one of the most violent biker clashes London had ever seen.
Who's who?
Outcasts versus Hells Angels UK. To understand what happened outside Battersea Arts Centre, we need to step back to the mid-1990s and look at the two clubs at the center of the fight. On one side stood the Outcasts Motorcycle Club, a group that had begun as a local club in the 1960s, but by the 1990s had chapters across parts of England. The Outcasts were known for being fiercely independent, but they also had ambitions. In 1997, they made a crucial move that would spark deadly consequences. They absorbed a smaller club called the Lost Tribe, based in Hertfordshire. That move was more than just patching over another chapter. In biker culture, it was a sign of growing strength and influence. On the other side stood the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, the most recognized name in outlaw motorcycling worldwide. Their presence in the UK dated back to 1969, and by the 90s, the British chapters carried weight far beyond their numbers. Estimates at the time put national membership for both clubs in the low hundreds, small compared to their American counterparts, but still powerful enough to shape the scene in Britain. With each group running bars, bike shops, and social events, territory and image mattered almost as much as money. The Outcasts' push to bring the Lost Tribe under their wing was seen by the Angels as a direct challenge. Reports later suggested that pressure came not only from British leadership, but also from the United States, where the Hells Angels World Council expected local charters to keep rivals in check or risk losing status. Whether this was strictly about control of the scene or about protection of illegal rackets like drugs and weapons is still debated. Police intelligence files from the time pointed to both theories. One camp believed it was mainly about pride and territory, while others argued it was about who controlled lucrative underground markets. At the local level, tensions were heating fastest in Essex. There, the Hells Angels had a fearsome reputation thanks to a group of members known as the Hatchet Crew. The name was not symbolic. They were said to carry hatchets and axes during confrontations, and stories of their violent clashes circulated widely. Their notoriety, combined with the outcasts' steady growth, meant that when members of both groups crossed paths, there was little chance of peace. So by the winter of 1998, the lines were clear. The outcasts wanted to show they could grow, even at the expense of smaller clubs. The Angels wanted to remind everyone that in Britain, only one name carried authority. Both groups were small in number, but big in reputation, and their rivalry was no longer a matter of rumor. It was about to spill violently into the public eye. The ambush. As dusk fell over South London, the atmosphere outside the Battersea Arts Centre was shifting. Inside, the reunion still carried on, music playing, drinks flowing, and memories being shared. But just beyond the doors, a very different plan was unfolding. Close to 40 members of the Hells Angels had converged from chapters across England. They weren't there to enjoy the nostalgia or listen to rock and roll. They had come armed and organized. Witnesses later told police and reporters that these men carried an arsenal of weapons: axes, machetes, knives, iron bars, pickaxe handles, tools designed not for intimidation, but for destruction. Even more chilling, many of them were wearing radio headsets, a detail that revealed the true nature of the assault. This wasn't spontaneous violence. It was a coordinated military-style operation. Some men were seen scanning the crowd like spotters, while others were clearly organized into strike groups, ready to launch at a signal. People who saw it unfold said the Angels moved with precision, as if roles had been assigned well in advance. The target was clear: members of the outcasts who were handling security for the event. At around 10 p.m., the violence erupted. Outcast David Flipper Armstrong, a 33-year-old father of two, was just arriving on his motorcycle. Before he could react, he was pulled from his bike. Witnesses described him being surrounded by attackers, hacked at with blades, and beaten with bars. Within moments, Armstrong was on the ground, bleeding heavily from multiple wounds. Hearing the commotion, another outcast, Malcolm Mal St. Clair, nicknamed the Terminator, rushed forward to help his friend. St. Clair, just 35 years old, found himself overwhelmed almost instantly. He was stabbed repeatedly, with reports stating he suffered 8 deep knife wounds to the chest and abdomen. He stumbled toward Lavender Hill, collapsing only a short distance from the local police station. Despite how close help was, the injuries were catastrophic. He died where he fell. The scale of the attack shocked bystanders. Hundreds of people were nearby, some leaving the reunion, others simply passing by the busy road. Yet the attackers did not panic, did not run wildly, and did not act as though they feared arrest. According to prosecutors at the Old Bailey later, the manner of the killings was calm and deliberate, carried out as though this was an execution, not a fight. One of the most haunting details came from a witness account repeated in court. After the stabbing, a man was overheard shouting, "I got the bastard. I got him. I did him." The words left no doubt that this was not a chaotic brawl, but a mission, carried out with deadly intent. Contemporary coverage from 1998 was consistent in describing Armstrong's death as resulting from a fatal hacking and stabbing assault. His injuries were so severe that reporters wrote about the brutality in detail. What is not disputed is the outcome: 2 men dead within minutes, both cut down in full view of the public. For those on Lavender Hill that night, it was a scene of disbelief. Shouts, blood, and chaos filled the air. Attendees who had come for a night of music were suddenly confronted with an image that felt more like a battlefield. Even though police were stationed nearby, the speed and ferocity of the ambush left almost no time to intervene. Within less than 10 minutes, the attack was over. The Angels melted away into the night, leaving behind the bodies of Armstrong and St. Clair, weapons scattered on the ground, and a community stunned by the boldness of what had just happened. Immediate aftermath on Lavender Hill. When the weapons went quiet, what was left behind on Lavender Hill was closer to a war zone than a reunion hall. The car park outside Battersea Arts Centre was littered with blood, broken glass, and weapons dropped in the rush to escape. Witnesses later recalled seeing knives, metal bars, even heavy wooden handles abandoned where the attackers had stood only moments before. Inside the building, The music had cut off, replaced by panic as people spilled out into the street, trying to understand what had just happened. Some screamed for help, others froze in shock. Survivors described it as complete chaos, an atmosphere that shifted from celebration to terror in seconds. The sheer boldness of the ambush left the community stunned. This wasn't an isolated alleyway or some hidden back street. It happened in front of hundreds of people in one of the busiest areas of South London. Officers rushed toward the scene almost immediately, but the damage had already been done. Armstrong and St. Clair lay dying. Medics tried to respond, but there was little they could do. Local press at the time stressed the brazenness. The Hells Angels had staged their assault not in secrecy, but in a crowded public space, confident enough to act without fear of being stopped. For many Londoners, it was the first time they realized just how dangerous the rivalry between outlaw motorcycle clubs had become. Operation Middlezoy, investigation, and trial. The Metropolitan Police knew they were facing more than just a local disturbance. Within hours, senior officers ordered the launch of a full-scale operation, given the name Operation Middlezoy. The goal was clear: track down those responsible for the killings and show that the law could still reach groups that prided themselves on silence and intimidation. Detectives immediately began gathering evidence from the scene. Dozens of weapons were recovered, along with blood samples and personal items left behind in the confusion. Witness statements poured in, but fear was already working against the investigation. Many attendees hesitated to go on record, worried about retaliation if they identified anyone. Raids soon followed across England. Police hit Hells Angels clubhouses and properties linked to the group, seizing documents, clothing, and motorcycles in hopes of tying individuals to the attack. After months of work, 3 men were eventually charged in connection with the ambush: Ronald Gut Waite, Vice President of the Essex Hells Angels, and 2 younger members, Barry Hollingsworth and Raymond Woodward, both described as prospects still proving themselves to the club. One of the most important pieces of evidence came from an unlikely source. Photographer Ramak Faisal had been present outside the Arts Center and managed to capture images of the Angels arriving and moving toward the building. Despite being threatened, Faisal agreed to testify and identify some of the men he had seen through his lens. His photographs became central to the prosecution's case, providing rare documentation of a violent moment that most others were too afraid to describe. By November of 1998, the case reached the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court. From the start, prosecutors made it clear how they intended to frame the attack. They described it as a brutal, planned, and premeditated assault. This wasn't a brawl that spun out of control. It was a coordinated mission, evidenced by the radio headsets and organized nature of the assault. But even before closing arguments, cracks appeared in the case. Key witnesses who had been expected to testify began to back out. Some changed their stories. Others refused to take the stand entirely. The atmosphere of intimidation that had plagued the investigation from the beginning now reached into the courtroom itself. Several witnesses who had initially agreed to testify withdrew at the last moment, terrified of reprisals from the Hells Angels or their associates. Without crucial witness cooperation, the Crown was forced to withdraw the murder charges against Hollingsworth and Woodward. That left only the conspiracy charge against Waite. The outcome shocked many observers. Waite was convicted of conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm and handed a 15-year sentence. In his final remarks, the judge condemned the ambush in unforgettable language, saying the 2 men had been executed, ruthless and arrogant, in full view of the public. Yet despite the outrage and clear evidence of a planned attack, no one was convicted of murder. 2 lives were lost, dozens of attackers had taken part, and the killings remained legally unsolved. The case highlighted a larger truth about the justice system. Proving guilt in cases of group violence is incredibly difficult when witnesses refuse to cooperate and codes of silence outweigh justice. If the killings shocked Londoners, they also raised a larger question. Why did it happen at all? For investigators and journalists digging into the biker scene, 2 main theories surfaced. The first was about growth and reputation. The outcasts' decision to absorb the lost tribe was seen as a direct challenge to Hells Angels' dominance. Law enforcement sources suggested that the Angels' international leadership expected local chapters to check such growth. If they failed, they risked losing respect, or even their official status, within the global Hells Angels network. From this perspective, the attack was less about profit and more about reputation. It was a violent reminder that no other club was allowed to grow unchecked in the Angels' territory. The second theory was about criminal markets. Some intelligence reports argued the feud had less to do with status and more to do with controlling illegal enterprises. Drugs, weapons, and the kinds of protection rackets outlaw motorcycle clubs were often linked to in the 1990s. By cutting down two men in public, the Angels could send a message that they controlled not only the streets, but also the underground economy that operated in the shadows. Whether it was reputation or profit, the ambush worked as a show of strength. By choosing the Rockers' reunion, an event the Outcasts had secured for years, the Angels staged their attack on the one night and place where their rivals would be most visible. It wasn't just about killing two men, it was about humiliating the Outcasts on their own ground, in front of their own people. The choice of venue turned the assault into a performance, meant to echo far beyond Lavender Hill. Public and media reaction. Fear of a biker war. News of the killings spread quickly through London and then across Britain. Newspapers called the ambush one of the most brazen acts of gang violence the city had seen in decades. The Guardian warned that a feud between rival clubs seemed set to explode, and reporters began linking the Battersea attack to a wider pattern of violence that had already been playing out in the shadows. Shootings, arson attacks, even attempted bombings tied to biker disputes. Battersea, in that context, looked less like an isolated clash and more like a watershed moment where a simmering conflict boiled into public view. What unsettled the public even more was the location. This wasn't some remote bar in the countryside. It was South London, in a busy district where families lived and shopped. Ordinary people could now see just how close this hidden subculture ran to their own lives. In the weeks that followed, television profiles and long-form features tried to explain the strange world of outlaw motorcycle clubs. Writers focused on how men who looked like neighbors or co-workers by day could be part of groups bound by a strict and often violent code. They pointed out that this same culture made prosecutions so difficult. Loyalty to the club was everything, and silence toward the police was enforced not just by threat, but by pride. For law enforcement, Battersea was a wake-up call. It proved that these rivalries could erupt in public, and that the old image of motorbike nostalgia was being replaced by something far more dangerous: legacy and memory. As the years passed, the shock of that winter night faded from the headlines, but it never vanished from memory, especially not on Lavender Hill. Local accounts describe how tributes began appearing near the spot where Malcolm Mall St. Clair collapsed. Wreaths, flowers, and biker patches were laid there, year after year, by outcasts and friends who refused to let the event slip into obscurity. On anniversaries, those quiet displays reminded passers-by that this was more than just a busy street. It was the site of a double killing that had gone unresolved in the courts. Residents of Battersea grew accustomed to the ritual, and in a way, the tributes kept the story alive longer than the official records ever could. Lavender-hill.uk, a community history project, continues to mark the event, preserving it as part of local heritage. To those who place the flowers, it is less about crime statistics and more about memory, ensuring that St. Clair's name and Armstrong's remain tied to the neighborhood where they fell, closer. In the end, the questions remain as stark as they were in 1998. How could a coordinated ambush, carried out in front of hundreds of people, in broad public view, end with no murder convictions? The Battersea Massacre showed both the reach of outlaw clubs and the limits of the justice system when silence, fear, and loyalty outweigh truth. Yet each year, flowers on Lavender Hill remind us that David Armstrong and Malcolm St. Clair were not just headlines, but lives cut short by a conflict that justice could never fully resolve.